My name is Rachel, and I want you to remember one sentence because everything in this story comes back to it. She wasn't close enough to the family. That's what my father said, out loud, in front of a room full of relatives, lawyers, and my own sister, 3 weeks after my grandmother's funeral. He said it like it was a fact, like it was something everybody already knew and had simply agreed not to mention until that exact moment. I was 34 years old. I was sitting in a leather chair in a law office that smelled like old paper and coffee, and I had just been told, in front of everyone, that I would receive nothing. Not the house, not the savings, not even the small ceramic bird my grandmother kept on her windowsill that I used to dust for her every single Sunday for 12 years. Nothing. My sister Melissa, sitting 2 seats away from me, didn't even try to hide her smile. I want to tell you right now, before this story goes any further, that what happened in that room was not the end. It was the beginning of something my family never saw coming. Because 5 weeks later, a different lawyer, a man none of us had ever met, called my phone and said 11 words that changed everything. Your grandmother left you something, and she left it in secret. But to understand why that phone call broke my family apart, you need to understand what happened in the 20 years before it. You need to understand what it means to be the invisible daughter, the one who shows up but is never seen, the one who does the work but never gets the credit. So let me take you back. Back to where all of this started. I grew up in a house where love was not given equally. It was given based on performance, based on appearance, based on how much attention you brought to the family name. My sister Melissa was 2 years older than me, and from the day I can remember anything, she was the star. She was the one in the school photos on the mantle. She was the one whose report cards got read out loud at dinner. She was the one my mother, Diane, introduced to every guest with a proud little smile, like she was presenting a trophy. I was the other one, the quiet one, the one who got good grades too, but nobody mentioned it, because good grades from me were expected, not celebrated. When Melissa got a B, it was a tragedy that required a family meeting. When I got a B, nobody noticed at all. My father, Robert, was a practical man. Cold, but not cruel in any way you could point to and call abuse. He believed love should be earned, and in his mind, Melissa had earned hers by being outgoing, sociable, the kind of daughter who made him look good at his company events. I was the daughter who stayed home and read books, and in his eyes, that made me less valuable somehow, less worth investing in. I remember one specific evening from when I was around 12 years old that captures this dynamic perfectly. Melissa had won some regional award for a school debate competition, and my parents threw together an impromptu celebration dinner, complete with her favorite dessert and my father raising a toast to his brilliant daughter. That same week, I had quietly won first place in a citywide math competition, something I hadn't even told my parents about because I assumed, correctly, that it wouldn't register the same way. When my teacher mentioned it to my mother in passing at pickup one day, my mother's response was simply, "Oh, that's nice," before turning back to a conversation with another parent about Melissa's upcoming debate finals. I didn't resent Melissa for this as a child. I understood even then, in the vague way children understand things, that this wasn't really about her. It was about what my parents valued and noticed, and what they didn't. Melissa's gift was visibility. Mine, apparently, was invisibility, and in my family, only one of those was considered worth celebrating. But there was one person in my life who never treated me that way. My grandmother, Eleanor. Grandma Eleanor lived alone in a small house at the edge of town, in a home she and my grandfather had bought together 40 years earlier, before he passed away when I was 9. After he died, something in my family shifted. My parents visited her out of obligation, a Sunday phone call here, a holiday dinner there. But it was always brief, always transactional. My mother would bring a store-bought pie, stay for exactly 90 minutes, and leave. I was different. I started visiting Grandma Eleanor on my own when I was 16 years old, riding my bike the 4 miles to her house every single Sunday afternoon. At first it was just to keep her company, but over the years, it became something much deeper. I learned how to make her favorite soup from scratch, the way her own mother had taught her, because her arthritis made it hard for her to stand at the stove for long. I drove her to every single doctor's appointment for the last 8 years of her life. Not my parents, not my sister, me. I sat with her during 2 hospital stays that my parents didn't even know had happened, because Grandma Eleanor asked me not to tell them. She said, and I remember this clearly, "I don't want your mother making a performance out of my sickness." I organized her medications into a weekly pill box every single Sunday. I helped her pay her bills online when her eyesight started to fail. I sat with her during the loneliest years of her life, after my grandfather was gone and her friends were passing away one by one, and I never once told anyone in my family how much time I was spending there, because it never occurred to me that it needed to be announced. I did it because I loved her, not because I wanted credit. That, it turns out, was my first mistake. Because while I was quietly showing up every single week for over a decade, my sister Melissa was doing something very different. She was showing up twice a year, Christmas and Grandma's birthday, with an expensive gift, a wide smile, and a story about her exciting life that she knew Grandma loved to hear. And my parents were doing the same. Occasional visits, big smiles, big performances of love, dropped in like scheduled appearances. And here's the thing about performances. They photograph well. They get remembered by everyone else in the family as being there. Meanwhile, the quiet, weekly, unglamorous work I was doing, the real caregiving, was invisible to everyone except the one person who actually needed it. I didn't know it yet, but Grandma Eleanor saw everything. She noticed who came only when it was convenient, and who came every single week for over a decade, rain or shine, expecting nothing in return. She noticed, and she remembered. As the years went on, the gap between how my family treated Melissa and how they treated me only grew wider. When Melissa got engaged at 26, my parents threw her an engagement party that cost more than my entire first year of rent. When I got engaged at 29 to a man named David, who I'll talk more about later, my mother's first comment was, "Well, at least someone will finally take care of you." When Melissa struggled financially in her late 20s, running through 2 failed business ventures that my parents quietly funded both times, nobody in the family called it a failure. They called it finding her path. When I asked my parents for a $5,000 loan to cover a medical bill after a car accident that wasn't my fault, my father said, and I remember every word of this, "We can't just hand out money to everyone who asks." I never asked again. There was another moment from this period that I think about often. When Melissa's second business venture, a boutique clothing line that never quite found its footing, finally folded after about 18 months, my parents hosted a small gathering they called a regroup dinner, where they told Melissa in front of extended family how proud they were of her for having the courage to try. I remember sitting at that dinner, genuinely happy for my sister, in the way you can be happy for someone, even while quietly aware of an imbalance, and also quietly wondering what kind of dinner my parents would have thrown for me if one of my own quieter, more careful decisions had failed instead. I already knew the answer. There would have been no dinner. There would have been a lecture about being more careful with money next time. Meanwhile, I kept showing up for Grandma Eleanor. Every Sunday. Rain, snow, illness, exhaustion. It didn't matter. And slowly, something started to happen that I didn't fully understand until years later. Grandma Eleanor started talking to me differently than she talked to anyone else in the family. She started telling me things, real things, about her marriage, about her regrets, about the ways she felt her own children, my father included, had drifted from the values she'd tried to raise them with. She told me once, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea between her hands, "You're the only one who comes here because you want to, not because you feel like you have to." I didn't think much of that sentence at the time. I thought she was just being kind, the way grandmothers often are. I had no idea that sentence was the seed of something much bigger, something that would eventually tear my family apart. Then, 4 years before she passed, Grandma Eleanor did something that, looking back now, was the first real clue. She asked me to come with her to a law office downtown, one I'd never heard her mention before. She told my parents it was just paperwork about the house. She told me nothing at all, other than that she needed a ride and someone to sit with her. I drove her there. I sat in the waiting room while she went into an office alone with a lawyer I had never met, a man named Gerald Hartley. She was in there for almost an hour. When she came out, she looked lighter somehow, like she'd set something down that had been weighing on her for a long time. On the drive home, I asked her what it was about. She just smiled and said, "Just making sure some things are taken care of properly, sweetheart. Don't worry about it." I didn't think about it again for 4 years. There is one more memory from that period I want to share, because it matters more than I realized at the time. About 6 months after that mysterious visit to the law office, Grandma Eleanor asked me a strange question while we were folding laundry together in her small back room. She asked, out of nowhere, "Rachel, if something happened to me, and the family found out I'd made a decision they didn't like, do you think you could handle people being angry at you, even if you'd done nothing wrong?" I remember laughing a little, thinking she was just being philosophical the way she sometimes was on quiet afternoons. I told her I supposed I could handle anything, as long as I knew I hadn't done anything to deserve it. She nodded slowly, folded a towel with careful, precise movements, and said, "Good. Remember you said that." I didn't understand then that she was testing the ground beneath a decision she had already made. I didn't understand that she was quietly checking whether the granddaughter she was about to protect had the strength to survive what protecting her might cost. I know now that she was preparing me, in her own careful, deliberate way, for a storm she could already see coming, long before any of us could. Grandma Eleanor's health began to decline seriously about 2 years before she passed. It started small, forgetting where she'd put her glasses, repeating a story she'd already told me twice in one visit. Then it became more serious. A fall in her kitchen that left her with a fractured wrist. A hospital stay for pneumonia that lasted 11 days. During all of this, I was the one at her bedside. I was the one who talked to her doctors, who filled out her medical forms, who slept in an uncomfortable hospital chair 3 nights in a row when her pneumonia turned serious and the doctors weren't sure which way it would go. I called my parents each time this happened. I want to be honest about that. I never hid these events from them. But every time the response was the same. My mother would say, "Oh no, that's terrible, keep us updated," and then wait for me to handle everything. My father would ask if it was serious, or just regular sick, as if there was a threshold of severity required before his presence became worth the trip. Melissa visited exactly once during that entire 2-year decline. She came to the hospital during the pneumonia stay, stayed for 40 minutes, took a photo of herself holding Grandma's hand that she posted online with the caption, "So grateful for every moment with this incredible woman," and then left for a work trip the next morning. That photo got over 300 likes. Nobody in my family knew or seemed to care that I was the one who'd been there for 11 straight days. I remember a nurse on the hospital floor, someone who had seen me there every single day of that stay, pulling me aside quietly on day 9 to ask if I was doing all right, noting gently that most family members she saw rotate shifts rather than sit alone around the clock for over a week. I told her there wasn't really anyone to rotate with. She gave me a look I still remember, somewhere between sympathy and quiet respect, and said, "Well, your grandmother is lucky to have you, even if she's the only one who seems to know it." I didn't think much of that comment at the time, exhausted as I was, but I've thought about it often since, especially once I understood just how much Grandma Eleanor really did know. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound like a saint. I'm telling you this because it matters for what comes later. Because there is a difference between the appearance of love and the practice of it. And my family, for years, rewarded the appearance while ignoring the practice. Grandma Eleanor knew the difference. She lived it, every single day, in the quiet hours when nobody else was around to see. About 8 months before she passed, During one of our Sunday visits, she said something to me that I've never forgotten. We were sitting on her back porch, the one that overlooked the garden my grandfather had planted decades earlier. She reached over, took my hand, and said, "Rachel, I need you to know something. What people show the world and what they actually give to it are two very different things. Don't ever confuse the two. And don't you dare let anyone convince you that showing up quietly, without applause, means it doesn't matter. It matters more than anything." I thought she was just giving me one of her gentle life lessons, the kind grandmothers give. I had no idea she was preparing me for what was coming. Around this same time, my husband David and I went through our own difficult chapter, one that I think matters here because of how differently my family and my grandmother responded to it. I was in a car accident on my way home from work. Not my fault. A driver ran a red light and struck the passenger side of my car. I wasn't seriously hurt, but I needed a minor surgery on my shoulder and weeks of physical therapy afterward, along with a medical bill that our insurance only partially covered. When I called my parents to tell them what happened, my mother asked if I needed anything, in the tone people use when they're hoping the answer is no. My father, when I later asked if they could help with a portion of the bill, $5,000 that would have meant nothing to their retirement savings, but meant everything to David and me at the time, said the words I mentioned earlier. "We can't just hand out money to everyone who asks." I never told him this, but I didn't ask my parents for help because I wanted a handout. I asked because for years, I had quietly watched them fund Melissa's ventures without hesitation, without question, without a single lecture about financial responsibility. I asked because some small part of me wanted to know if love, in my family, could ever be extended to me the way it was so easily extended to her. The answer, that day, was no. David, watching all of this unfold from the outside, once told me something that stuck with me for years afterward. He came from a family that was far from perfect in its own ways, but one where his parents had always split things evenly between him and his brother, almost to the point of obsessive fairness, counting dollars and minutes to make sure neither child ever felt shortchanged. He told me, gently, during one particularly hard week after the medical bill conversation, that he sometimes forgot other families didn't operate that way, and that watching my parents make me feel guilty for simply asking for help was something he genuinely couldn't wrap his mind around, no matter how many times I tried to explain the dynamic to him. "It's not normal, Rachel," he said quietly one night. "I know it feels normal to you because it's what you grew up with, but it's not." Grandma Eleanor found out about the accident 2 weeks later, not from me, but from a comment I made in passing during one of our Sunday visits about my shoulder still being sore. She was furious that I hadn't told her sooner, and without me asking, without me even hinting, she wrote me a check that same afternoon for the exact amount I still owed on the medical bill. When I tried to refuse it, she took my hand, looked me directly in the eyes, and said, "Rachel, I have watched you take care of everyone around you your whole life and ask for nothing back. Let someone take care of you for once. Don't argue with an old woman." I cried in my car in her driveway for almost 20 minutes before I could drive home. I think, looking back now, that was the moment something shifted permanently in how she thought about the future of her estate. Not because of the money itself, but because of what that day revealed about which family members showed up when it actually cost something, and which ones only showed up when it was easy. Grandma Eleanor passed away on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I was the one who found her. I had come for my usual Sunday visit 2 days earlier, and noticed she seemed unusually tired, unusually quiet. I almost stayed the night, but she insisted she was fine and sent me home, telling me she'd see me next week. She never made it to next week. The funeral was, in its own strange way, exactly what you'd expect from my family. My mother organized an elaborate service with white lilies and a string quartet that Grandma Eleanor, a woman who preferred simple hymns and quiet gatherings, would never have chosen for herself. My father gave a eulogy about her strength and grace that felt like it had been written by someone who barely knew her, full of generic phrases that could have applied to anyone's grandmother. Melissa cried beautifully throughout the entire service. I want to say that carefully, because I don't doubt that some of her grief was real. Losing a grandmother is a real loss, regardless of how present you were in her life. But there was a performance quality to it that I couldn't ignore, the same performance quality that had defined her relationship with Grandma Eleanor for years. She sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a tissue at exactly the right moments, accepting condolences from relatives with practiced grace. I sat 2 rows back, quiet, exhausted, still processing the fact that the person I had spent every Sunday with for 18 years was gone. Nobody asked me to speak at the service. Nobody thought to. I want to pause here and tell you about the one moment during that entire funeral that felt real to me. An elderly woman I didn't recognize, one of Grandma Eleanor's few remaining friends from her old neighborhood, found me afterward near the parking lot. She took my hand and said, "You're the granddaughter who visits every Sunday, aren't you? Eleanor talked about you constantly. She used to say you were the only person who ever came just to sit with her, not to be seen sitting with her." I didn't know what to say. I just thanked her and held on to that sentence for weeks afterward, a single moment of recognition in a day otherwise defined by generic eulogies and performed grief. After the funeral, at the reception held at my parents' house, I overheard my mother telling a cousin, "Eleanor and Melissa were always so close. Melissa really understood her." I stood in the kitchen doorway, holding a plate I wasn't eating from, and said nothing. What was there to say? In my family's version of history, showing up occasionally with a smile counted as closeness, and showing up every single week for 18 years, doing the real, unglamorous work of caring for someone, apparently didn't count for anything at all. I didn't know yet that 3 weeks later, in a law office downtown, that exact belief, that Melissa was the closer, more devoted granddaughter, would be used to justify cutting me out of everything. There was one more moment at that reception I need to tell you about, because it stayed with me for weeks afterward. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had left, I found myself alone in Grandma Eleanor's old bedroom, which my mother had already started sorting through, boxes half packed on the bed. I picked up a small framed photo from her nightstand. It was a picture of the two of us, taken the previous summer on her back porch, both of us laughing at something I don't even remember anymore. My mother walked in while I was holding it and said gently enough, "You can keep that one if you want, sweetheart. I don't think anyone else would want it anyway." I remember the sentence landing strangely in my chest, meant as a kindness, but revealing, without either of us realizing it in the moment, exactly how the family saw our relationship. A photo nobody else would want. A closeness that existed, apparently, only for me to privately treasure and nobody else to publicly acknowledge. I took the photo home that night. It sits on my own nightstand today, and I think about that sentence every time I look at it. 3 weeks after the funeral, my family gathered at the office of Franklin Meyer, my parents' family lawyer, to hear the reading of Grandma Eleanor's will, or at least the will everyone believed was her only will. I want to describe this room carefully, because every detail matters. It was a formal conference room with a long table, my father at the head, my mother beside him, Melissa on the other side, and me at the far end, closest to the door. Mr. Meyer sat across from all of us with a folder in front of him. He read through the standard language first. The house, valued at just under $400,000, to be split between the surviving children, meaning my father and his one sibling, my Uncle Thomas, who had passed away 5 years earlier, meaning that portion would go entirely to my father. Then the savings account, just over $200,000, split evenly between my father and my aunt on my grandfather's side. Then came the personal items, and this is where things turned. Mr. Meyer read that Grandma Eleanor's jewelry, her late husband's pocket watch, and a small collection of family heirlooms were to go to Melissa, in recognition of her closeness with her grandmother in her final years. I remember my stomach dropping. Not because I cared about jewelry, I never had, but because of that phrase, closeness in her final years. As if Melissa had been the one at the hospital. As if Melissa had been the one driving to doctor's appointments, filling pill boxes, sitting through 11-day pneumonia stays. Then Mr. Meyer looked at me directly and said the words I will never forget as long as I live. Rachel, your grandmother's will does not include a specific bequest to you. The estate documentation notes that your relationship with the deceased was, in her words, less close in recent years compared to other family members. I sat there in complete silence. I felt like the air had been pulled out of the room. My father, without even a flicker of discomfort, said, "Well, that settles that then," and reached for his water glass like we'd just finished discussing dinner reservations, not the complete erasure of 18 years of my life. Melissa, to her credit, at least had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. But she said nothing. She let the silence sit. I asked, my voice shaking, if there was some mistake. Mr. Meyer, a kind enough man just doing his job, shook his head gently and said the will had been drafted and notarized 3 years earlier and reviewed once more just 14 months before her passing, and there had been no changes since. 3 years earlier. That timeline would matter a great deal later. But in that moment, all I could think was, how could the woman I drove to over 200 doctor's appointments, the woman whose hand I held during 11 nights in a hospital, the woman who told me on her back porch that quiet love mattered more than performance, how could that same woman leave a legal document saying I wasn't close to her? It didn't make sense, and it took everything in me not to break down crying right there at that table, in front of my father's cold indifference and my mother's barely concealed relief. Because here's what I understood in that moment, sitting in that chair, staring at a document that erased me. My parents had spent years building a story where Melissa was the devoted granddaughter and I was the distant one. And somehow, that story had made its way into a legal document that would now define, permanently, how the world remembered my relationship with my grandmother. I left that office that day, believing the woman who loved me most in this world had, in her final legal act, agreed with everyone else that I didn't matter. I remember the drive home from that office more clearly than almost anything else in this entire story. David was waiting for me in the parking lot, because I'd asked him not to come inside. Some instinct in me had wanted to face that room alone, though I'm still not sure why. When I got into the car, I didn't cry right away. I just sat there, staring at the dashboard, feeling like something inside my chest had been quietly hollowed out. David asked me what happened, and I remember trying to explain it and finding that the words wouldn't come out right. I kept saying, "She said I wasn't close enough. She said it in front of everyone." I must have repeated that sentence 8 or 9 times on the drive home, like my mind couldn't process it any other way except by saying it out loud, over and over, hoping that somewhere in the repetition it would start to make sense. It never did. That night, I pulled out an old shoebox of photographs I kept in our closet, pictures from over a decade of Sundays at Grandma Eleanor's house, some of them faded, some of them taken on disposable cameras from years before smartphones existed. I spread them across our bedroom floor and looked at every single one, searching for some kind of proof, some kind of evidence I could hold on to that what I remembered had actually been real. David sat beside me on the floor for almost 2 hours that night, not saying much, just being present, while I quietly cataloged 18 years of a relationship a legal document had just told me didn't count. I was wrong about what that document meant, but I wouldn't find that out for 5 more weeks. The weeks after the will reading were some of the loneliest of my life. My mother called me twice in that period, both times to ask if I was doing okay with everything, in a tone that suggested she expected the answer to be a quick, reassuring yes, so she could move on with her day. When I tried to actually talk about how much it hurt, she changed the subject to a home renovation project within about 90 seconds. My father didn't call at all. Melissa sent one text message. It said, "Hey, sorry things turned out the way they did with the will. Let me know if you want any of Grandma's stuff. I have more than I need, LOL." I stared at that message for a long time. I didn't respond. My husband David was the only person who really understood what this had done to me. He watched me go quiet in a way I hadn't been in years. He watched me pull out old photos of Grandma Eleanor and cry alone in our bedroom at night, trying to reconcile the woman in those photos, the woman who held my hand and told me love isn't measured by performance, with a legal document that said I wasn't close enough to matter. I started doubting my own memory. I started wondering if maybe I had imagined the depth of our relationship. Maybe I had built up in my mind something that, to her, had simply been ordinary family obligation. Grief has a cruel way of making you question the realest things you've ever felt. There was a particular Sunday during those 5 weeks that I want to describe, because it captures how deep the damage went. It was the first Sunday since Grandma Eleanor's passing that fell on what would have been our usual visiting day, and out of pure habit, I found myself getting into my car around 2 in the afternoon before catching myself and remembering there was nowhere left to drive to. I sat in the driveway for almost 10 minutes with the engine running, not going anywhere, just feeling the shape of a routine that no longer had a destination. I called my therapist, someone I'd been seeing on and off for a few years for general anxiety, and asked for an emergency session that week. I told her about the will reading, about the sentence "not close enough," about the strange sensation of grieving two things at once, the loss of my grandmother and the loss of what I'd believed our relationship had meant. She told me something that stayed with me through those 5 weeks, even though at the time I didn't fully believe it. She said, "Documents can say things that aren't true, Rachel. A legal paper reflects what someone chose to write down, not necessarily what someone felt. Don't let a piece of paper rewrite 18 years of Sundays." I wanted to believe her. But grief is not always rational, and for those 5 weeks, the paper felt louder than the Sundays. I threw myself into work during those weeks. I run a small accounting practice, and I buried myself in client files just to have something to focus on besides the hollow feeling in my chest. I stopped visiting my parents' house except for the bare minimum of holiday obligation. I stopped speaking to Melissa entirely. And then, exactly 5 weeks and 2 days after the will reading, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm someone who typically doesn't answer unknown numbers. But something made me pick it up that afternoon. Call it instinct, call it grief, call it whatever you want. I picked up the phone. A man's voice, calm and formal, introduced himself. "Good afternoon. Is this Rachel? My name is Gerald Hartley. I'm an estate attorney. I represented your grandmother, Eleanor, in a private matter 4 years ago, and I need to speak with you regarding a document she asked me to hold in confidence until after her passing." I felt my whole body go still. Gerald Hartley. The name meant nothing to me consciously, but something in the back of my mind stirred. And then I remembered. The law office downtown. The hour-long meeting I'd waited outside of 4 years earlier. The one Grandma Eleanor told me was just paperwork about the house. I asked him what this was about, and he said the words that changed everything. "Your grandmother left you something, and she left it in secret." I sat across from Gerald Hartley in his office 3 days later, my hands trembling slightly as he opened a folder on his desk. David had come with me, sitting quietly in the chair beside mine, holding my hand. Mr. Hartley was an older man, maybe in his late 60s, with the calm, deliberate manner of someone who had spent decades delivering both good news and devastating news in equal measure, and had learned to do both with the same steady patience. He began by explaining something I hadn't known. 4 years earlier, Grandma Eleanor had come to him, not to Franklin Meyer, the family lawyer everyone knew about, specifically because she wanted a document that her son, my father, would have no knowledge of and no ability to influence. She had told Mr. Hartley, in his words, that she needed a lawyer who had never met her family and never would. She had established what's called a revocable living trust, not something written into the public will that Franklin Meyer had read 3 weeks after her funeral. A completely separate legal structure, funded quietly over the following 4 years, that existed entirely outside the estate everyone believed was her only remaining assets. I asked what was in it. My voice came out smaller than I expected, almost a whisper, like some part of me was afraid that asking too loudly might make the answer disappear. Mr. Hartley took his time, the way careful professionals do when they know the next few minutes are going to reshape someone's entire understanding of their family. He explained that the property nobody knew about, the lake cabin, had originally belonged to my great-grandparents and had passed to Grandma Eleanor decades earlier when they died. My father, it turned out, had always assumed that cabin had been sold off sometime in the 1990s, a detail he'd apparently mentioned once at a family gathering years ago, dismissively, as one of those old properties nobody bothered keeping track of. Grandma Eleanor had simply let that assumption stand, quietly hiring a small property management company 2 towns over to handle renters, collecting modest but steady rental income for over a decade without a single member of my family suspecting it still existed. Mr. Hartley slid a document across the desk toward me. And there, in careful legal language, it explained that over the previous 4 years, Grandma Eleanor had transferred a second, undisclosed savings account, a small investment portfolio she had built quietly with my grandfather's life insurance payout decades earlier that nobody in the family knew still existed, and the detail that made my breath catch in my throat, a second property. A small lake cabin 2 hours outside the city that had belonged to her own parents and had been sitting, paid off in full and rented out quietly for over a decade through a property management company, generating income that had simply been funneled into that same trust. The total value of the trust, Mr. Hartley told me, calmly, as though he were reading off a weather report and not detonating a bomb inside my chest, was just over $1,100,000. And every single cent of it belonged, entirely and exclusively, to me. I sat frozen. I asked him, my voice barely above a whisper, why? Why would she hide this? Why wouldn't she just leave it to me openly, in the will everyone already knew about? Mr. Hartley leaned back in his chair for a moment before answering, choosing his words carefully, the way people do when they're about to explain something they promised someone else they would explain gently. He told me that Grandma Eleanor had actually raised the idea of a public bequest herself in one of their very first meetings, before ultimately deciding against it. She told him she had watched, over the years, how quickly money could turn a family against itself, even while everyone was still alive to fight about it, and she didn't want her final years spent mediating a war between her son and her granddaughter over what she had or hadn't decided to leave behind. She wanted peace while she was living. She wanted truth after she wasn't. And she trusted Mr. Hartley, a man completely outside our family's orbit, to be the one to make sure both of those wishes were honored, in their proper order, at their proper time. Mr. Hartley reached into the folder again and pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written on it in my grandmother's familiar, looping handwriting. He said she had asked him to give me this letter, and only this letter, at the moment the trust was revealed, and that she had specifically instructed him not to summarize its contents for me, only to hand it over and let me read it myself. He gave David and me privacy in a small side room. My hands shook so badly, it took me almost a full minute to open the envelope. Inside, in my grandmother's handwriting, was a letter that I will paraphrase for you now, because I want to honor her words by keeping some of them just for me, but the meaning of what she wrote will stay with me for the rest of my life. She explained that she had watched, for years, the way my parents treated me differently than they treated Melissa. She explained that she knew exactly what was happening every single Sunday I showed up at her door, and every single Sunday Melissa didn't. She said she had made a decision, 4 years before her death, that the world could believe whatever comfortable story it wanted to believe about who was close to her and who wasn't, because she knew the truth, and the truth didn't need anyone else's permission to exist. She wrote that she deliberately left the public will exactly as everyone expected it to look, because she knew that if she left me anything openly, my father would spend her final years pressuring her, guilt-tripping her, trying to convince her to change her mind, the way he had done with smaller decisions throughout her life. She wanted her final years to be peaceful, not a battlefield over money. So she gave the family the story they already believed, and she gave me the truth, quietly, safely, where no one could take it from me or argue me out of it. And then she wrote the sentence that broke me completely, sitting in that small side office with David's arms around me. She wrote, "You were never the one who wasn't close enough, Rachel. You were the only one who ever was." I sat with that letter for a long time after I finished reading it. David came in at some point and found me on the floor of that small side office, the letter still in my hands, and he didn't say anything at first. He just sat down next to me and held me while I cried the kind of tears that come from finally understanding something you'd spent weeks doubting. When I was ready, Mr. Hartley walked us through the practical details. He explained that because the trust had been properly funded and administered for 4 full years before Grandma Eleanor's passing, with regular documented meetings and clear, consistent instructions recorded at every single visit, it was about as legally solid as a trust could be. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that he had specifically required a brief cognitive assessment from Grandma Eleanor's own physician at the time the trust was created, not because he doubted her, but because, as he told her at the time, he wanted to make absolutely certain that if anyone ever tried to challenge it later, there would be no shadow of doubt to hide behind. She had agreed immediately. Mr. Hartley told me she'd said, with a small laugh he clearly remembered fondly, "Make it airtight, Gerald. My son can be stubborn when money's involved." She had known. She had known exactly what kind of resistance this decision might face one day, and she had spent 4 careful years making absolutely certain that no one would ever be able to take it away from me, or twist it into something it wasn't. I want to be honest with you about something. My first instinct, sitting in that lawyer's office with that letter in my hands, was not revenge. It was grief. A different kind of grief than I had felt at the funeral. The grief of understanding, fully, how much my grandmother had truly seen me, and how much pain she must have carried, watching her own son and his wife slowly erase her real relationship with me in favor of a version of the story that was easier for the family to believe. But grief has a way of turning into clarity, and clarity, eventually, demanded a conversation. I didn't tell my parents right away. I sat with the truth for almost 2 weeks, working with Mr. Hartley to understand the legal process of the trust distribution, talking to David every night about how to handle what came next. And then I decided. I wasn't going to hide this the way my grandmother had hidden it during her life. Her reasons for secrecy were about protecting her peace while she was alive. Mine were different. I wanted my family, once and for all, to understand exactly what they had done and exactly how wrong they had been. I called a family dinner. My parents, Melissa, David, and I, at my parents' house, 3 months after the funeral. I brought the folder with me. We sat at the same dining table where, for years, Melissa's achievements had been celebrated out loud, and mine had passed by in silence. I waited until dinner was finished, until my father had poured his usual glass of wine, and then I placed the folder on the table. I told them everything. About Gerald Hartley, about the trust, about the lake cabin, the second savings account, the investment portfolio built quietly over decades. I told them the number, $1,100,000, left entirely and exclusively to me, by a woman they had all, in that law office 3 weeks after her funeral, agreed was closer to my sister than to me. The silence in that room was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my family. My mother's face went white. My father set down his wine glass very slowly, the way people do when they're trying to buy themselves time to think. Melissa, to her credit, was the first to speak, and what she said surprised me. She said quietly, "She always did notice more than we gave her credit for." Then, after a pause, she added something I didn't expect at all. She looked directly at me and said, "Honestly, Rachel? Good. You earned every bit of it. I mean that." It was the first time in years my sister had said something to me without a hint of competition underneath it, and even in the middle of all that tension, I noticed it. My father, however, did not take it well. He accused me of manipulating an elderly, possibly confused woman. He said the word undue influence like a legal threat, as if daring me to bring it to court, clearly not understanding that undue influence claims require proving the deceased person's independent judgment was compromised, and Grandma Eleanor's letter, along with 4 years of documented, witnessed legal meetings with an attorney completely unconnected to our family, was about as far from confused and manipulated as a legal case could possibly get. I let him say his piece. And then I said something I had rehearsed in my head for 2 weeks, sitting with David at our kitchen table, trying to find the right words that would finally, permanently, put this to rest. I said, "Dad, you called me not close enough at a lawyer's office in front of our entire family. You didn't know that. 3 years before that day, the woman you were talking about had already written down, in her own handwriting, that I was the only one who ever truly was. You don't get to be angry that she saw the truth. You only get to sit with the fact that you didn't." Nobody said anything for a long time after that. My father eventually broke the silence, and not in the way I expected. He didn't apologize, not that night. Instead, he asked a question that, looking back, revealed more about him than any accusation could have. He asked, "Did she ever say why? Did she ever tell you what we did wrong?" I told him the truth. I said she never said a single negative word about him to me, not once, in 18 years of Sundays. She never used me as a place to vent about her son, never turned our visits into a forum for family grievances. She simply showed her love in the way she chose to, quietly, consistently, and let her actions, in the end, speak for themselves in a way her words never had to. My father sat with that for a long moment, staring at the folder on the table, and then he said something I'll remember for the rest of my life. He said quietly, almost to himself, "She was always better at seeing people than I was." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to self-awareness I had ever heard from him, and in that moment, it felt like something had cracked open, even if it hadn't fully broken free yet. My mother, for her part, left the table at one point and returned a few minutes later with red eyes, having clearly cried somewhere out of sight rather than in front of us. She sat back down and asked to see the letter, not the financial documents, just the letter, the one from Grandma Eleanor. I hesitated for a moment, because that letter had felt like the one thing in this entire ordeal that belonged only to me. But eventually I decided that my mother deserved to understand, in Grandma Eleanor's own words, what her mother-in-law had actually seen over the years. I let her read it. She read it twice. When she finished, she folded it carefully back along its original creases, handed it back to me with both hands, the way you'd return something precious and breakable, and said, "I think I always knew somewhere that you were the one really showing up. I just found it easier to believe the version where we all were." That sentence, more than anything else said at that table, is the one I've thought about the most since, because I think it captures something true about how families like mine operate. It's not always active cruelty. Sometimes it's simply the comfort of a shared, convenient story, one that lets everyone believe they're doing enough, even when only one person actually is. I want to tell you honestly that this story doesn't end with some perfect, tidy reconciliation, because real families rarely get those. My father and I are still working through what happened. It's slow. Some weeks it feels like progress. Other weeks it feels like we're right back at that dining table, silent and staring at each other across a gap that took 34 years to form and won't close in a single conversation. My mother apologized in her own way, about 2 months later. It wasn't the apology I might have written for her if I'd been given the chance, but it was real, and I could tell it cost her something to say it out loud. She told me she had convinced herself over the years that Melissa's visits meant more than mine because they were louder, more visible, easier to talk about at dinner parties. She said watching me hold that folder at the table made her realize, for the first time, that she had mistaken performance for love her entire life, and it had cost her the chance to really know her own daughter. Melissa and I have talked more in the months since than we had in the previous 5 years combined. She admitted something to me privately that I didn't expect, that she always sensed, somewhere underneath the surface, that I was the one really showing up, and that some small part of her had leaned into being the favorite precisely because it was easier than doing the quiet, unglamorous work that real caregiving requires. I don't know if we'll ever be close in the way sisters are supposed to be, but we're talking. That's more than we had before. In the months that followed that dinner, something slowly began to shift in the rhythm of my family. Small changes that I didn't fully trust at first, having spent 34 years learning not to expect them. My father started calling more often, awkward, halting phone calls where he'd ask about my work or David's job, small talk that felt, for the first time, like an actual attempt rather than an obligation. He never became the father who celebrated me the way he'd once celebrated Melissa, and I've made peace with the idea that he may never fully become that. But he stopped, at least pretending that the story he and my mother had told themselves for years was the only true version of events. I also want to tell you about a conversation I had with Melissa about 6 months after that dinner, one that surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire story. We met for coffee, just the two of us, something we hadn't done in years. She told me she had gone back, after that dinner, and looked through old photos from our childhood, trying to understand how two sisters raised in the same house could have had such different experiences of it. She said she found photo after photo of herself smiling at the center of attention, and photo after photo of me standing slightly to the side, present but unremarked upon. She said it was the first time she had actually seen the pattern instead of simply living inside of it without noticing. She told me she was sorry, not for anything specific she had done intentionally, because she genuinely didn't believe she had set out to hurt me, but sorry for never once, in 30 years, stopping to ask why I always seemed a little quieter at family gatherings, why I never pushed back when the spotlight passed over me and landed, again and again, on her. I appreciated that apology more than I expected to. It didn't erase 3 decades of imbalance, but it was honest, and honesty, I've learned, is worth more than perfect words. As for the money, the trust, the lake cabin, the investment account my grandmother built quietly over decades, I didn't do anything dramatic with it. I didn't buy a mansion. I didn't quit my job in some grand gesture of vindication. David and I used part of it to pay off our own home. We used another part to set up a fund that helps cover medical costs for elderly patients in our city who don't have family nearby to advocate for them, something I named, with Mr. Hartley's help, in honor of my grandmother. And the lake cabin, the one she quietly kept rented out for over a decade without anyone knowing it existed, I kept that one for myself. I go there most weekends now. I sit on the porch, the way she used to sit on hers, and I think about the 18 years I spent showing up for a woman who, it turns out, was quietly making sure that showing up would never go unrewarded, even if the reward came only after she was gone. I brought that small framed photo from her nightstand with me the first weekend I stayed at the cabin, the one my mother told me nobody else would want. I set it on a little side table by the porch chair, facing the same view Grandma Eleanor must have looked at during quiet afternoons of her own, decades before I ever knew this place existed. I like to think she sat somewhere very much like this, in a life she built quietly on her own terms, long before any of us understood what she'd been planning all along. I also finally opened the small keepsake box Mr. Hartley handed me on our second meeting, the one containing a handful of personal items Grandma Eleanor had specifically set aside for me within the trust, separate from the public estate entirely. Inside was her late husband's old pocket watch, not the one listed in the public will that went to Melissa, but a second one, older, the one my grandfather actually carried every day of his working life, the one Grandma Eleanor told me once, years earlier, was the real one, not the one for show. I hadn't understood that comment when she made it. I understand it perfectly now. Here's what I want you to take from this story, if you take anything at all. Love, the real kind, is rarely the loudest thing in the room. It's not the grand gesture, the expensive gift, the perfectly timed photo with the perfectly captured tears. It's the quiet Sunday visits nobody applauds. It's the hospital chairs nobody else sits in. It's the pill boxes nobody else fills. And sometimes, the people who see that kind of love most clearly are not the ones standing closest to you in the family photo. Sometimes it's the one person who is quietly watching everything, deciding, in her own time and her own way, that the truth deserves to be honored, even if the world only finds out about it after she's gone. My grandmother taught me that being overlooked by the people who are supposed to see you clearly does not mean you are invisible. It means sometimes that the person who truly sees you is simply waiting for the right moment to make sure the whole world finally does too. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever felt like the quiet one in a family that only celebrates the loud ones, I want you to know someone sees you. And sometimes the truth takes its time, but it always finds its way home.